And thank you all for being here. I was going to ask how many people had seen the exhibition. Michelene beat me to it. I'm so pleased that so many of you have seen it. So my talk today will go behind the scenes of how this sort of random mashup happened. And I expect to talk for maybe 45 or so minutes, so I'm just going to jump right into it. So I'll just take a couple of minutes or so to acquaint those of you in the audience who don't know about this special place in Rancho Mirage called Sunnylands. This building and property is the Sunnylands Center, constructed in 2012. The entrance is on Bob Hope Drive. Most of you know that. I saw all the hands. So this is the building in which the exhibition can be found. The center is open free to the public Wednesday through Sunday and offers a full schedule of programming, such as this, free yoga every Friday on the Great Lawn during season. Across the hedgerow from the center sits this 1966 historic home on 200 acres. This is the former private home of ambassadors Leonore and Walter Annenberg, and they left this, their beloved estate, to the public, a place they called Sunnylands. And here you see the two properties side by side. The center's the rectangle on the lower right. The Annenbergs were very specific about what role they wanted their estate to play, both locally for our community and globally. They outlined two very specific missions. One of these is to provide educational opportunities to the public, such as exhibitions, tours, classes, family days, and we really, Michelene and her team, develop a full calendar of programs, such as this, which is the annual olive harvest on the historic property. And they asked that we continue to make the estate available as a bilateral meeting space to all former and future presidents of the United States, as well as other leaders working for the greater good. So what makes this place so special, and why is it recognized as an important historic home? Well, the social history of this property was and continues to be remarkable for its breadth. A total of 8 presidents of the United States have not only visited, but many spent considerable official and leisure time at Sunnylands. The social history alone makes this home an important heritage site for sure. In fact, President Obama chose Sunnylands, many of you know, as the place to meet China's President Xi Jinping in 2013. And then he doubled down in 2016 when he brought presidents of Vietnam, Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Indonesia, President of Laos, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and the Vice President of Myanmar. There was lots of security for that. I actually dare to say that Sunnylands is the most interesting former private historic home in America for the killer combo of not only its remarkable social history, but coupled with its built characteristics. And no one has challenged me yet. So the built characteristics, well, they're simply off the charts for fans of architecture, mid-century architecture, exuberant mid-century architecture, and Mayan modern. It's also a real pearl clutcher for its gorgeous historic landscape design, the fine European art and other collections and archives, interior design. The home boasts an encyclopedic collection of custom William Haynes furniture, soaring architectural and landscape views, and well, I could go on and on and on and on, but for the purposes of today, that summarizes what the estate was and continues to be. So, within the context of our mission to explore the Annenberg's home, history, and art, we turn now to our 8th exhibition. So why, you may wonder, does this exhibition create a mashup of the artwork of the famous musician and artist Herb Alpert with the artwork of the Hunt family, who are a First Nations Kwakiutl people from Vancouver Island, Canada? Well, it all started in '76 when the Annenbergs brought to their desert home a masterwork example of traditional North Coast Canadian carving. This is a 30-foot red cedar totem pole, which still heroically resides on the 5th fairway. I discovered in the files at Sunnylands that both Leonore and Walter had a long-standing admiration for Canadian totem poles, and they desired a First Nations pole for their winter home, Sunnylands. And their research led them to identify the best-in-class living artist in West Coast carving. They commissioned their pole from master carver, 3-time chief, Henry Hunt. Henry Hunt was an art star. He was a member of the preeminent Hunt family with many distinctions, including that it was he and his family who carved a 100-foot pole for the Queen of England, shown here. They are also the family who are largely credited with preserving Kwakiutl history, language, customs, songs, and material culture through their personal stewardship. I'll show you just a few of the family's famous poles. Here's the totem pole, which was gifted to the Queen in '58. It remains today in Windsor Great Park in England. This 40-plus foot beauty still stands today in Plaza Canada in Buenos Aires, as does this pole in Chapultepec Park, Mexico City. So, the Henry Hunt pole arrived at Sunnylands in '76, and I arrived 33 years later in 2009 as the person responsible for the collections on site. So I had to find, identify, catalog, and restore the collections ahead of the public opening. We had no idea what we had. I had a lot of work to do on this one artwork alone. In fact, I thought this artwork was probably the most at risk, so it was my first restoration project when I arrived. And remember, we just arrived. We hadn't organized the boxes and filing cabinets filled with paperwork all over the estate, so I didn't know anything about this totem. I was starting with nothing. It was infested with ants, it was tilting, a tree had grown around it, and a squirrel had moved in. This is often the natural and expected order for a totem, to dissolve back into the earth. But I had to know more to know what to do. When you're managing a cultural object, there's really no room for error. And so after some digging, I found the artist's name, Henry Hunt. Thanks to Google, I learned that the original carver, Henry, was deceased, but I found online his son, Stan, and I called him. I told him of my predicament, that I didn't want this beautiful pole to suddenly fall down on my watch. And he, hearing my anxiety, interjected and said, "Anne, I'll come down there and I'll restore my dad's pole for you." We were thrilled at this news, of course. So Stan also told me how he wanted the pole to be laid down before he arrived so he could restore it. And so in came the crane. And we started digging, and digging and digging. We dug about 13 feet down, and we still hadn't found the bottom of that pole, when suddenly it released from its mount and it twirled into the sky. Just that little bit of tension that the crane was putting on it helped it snap where it was most rotted. We were very lucky where it broke. And here it is waiting for the famous Hunt family to arrive. We added a sun shield. And here Stan sees it for the first time. It was very emotional. I saw him studying it so closely. He smiled at times, he looked sad at times. He saw a whole story in this pole that I certainly didn't see. He brought with him his son Jason and his wife Lavina as well. And so the family lives on northern Vancouver Island. And so the first thing they did was they ditched the sunshade. They were very happy to be working in the sun. They got their vitamin D out there. So the design on a pole is called the form line. The pole had been repainted through the years, and the form line had drifted here and there. So they corrected the line and brought it back to where it had originally been. And they brought the colors back to where they had originally been. The fresh paint was beautiful. And in fact, the Hunts had asked me to buy some paint ahead of their arrival. And they told me the colors and asked me to get them some bear paint. And I thought, of course, they meant some sort of exotic bear oil grizzly paint of some sort. My mind went to some crazy ancient technique, but of course they meant the Home Depot brand, B-E-H-R. They said, "Don't you have a Home Depot? That's the bear paint we need." So they worked on the pole for about 2 weeks. And of course, we needed a new mount. So a new mount was manufactured. The pole was hollowed on the bottom, and up it went. The Hunts weren't here for the remounting, but approved of the mount design from afar. Then the Hunts generously said that when we eventually opened to the public, they'd like to return to the desert and rededicate the pole in a public ceremony. And so they did. 2 years after the restoration, they returned. In 2012, we opened to the public, and this was our first public event. There was drumming and a private blessing of the pole, and Henry's extended family made the trip. And there was dancing and singing, and throughout I kept noticing these beautiful textiles. There were many feathers and songs involved. The family also brought textiles and carvings to share with the public. Stan and Jason set up a carving demonstration, as they will again on January 26th. I saw these beautiful artworks and my heart raced. I imagined that one day an exhibition of Kwakiutl art could and should happen at Sunnylands. And so by the end of this 2-year journey, we were more than friends, we were family. And I knew someday I had to bring their work back here. So in 2014, I was reading a magazine in an airport, and I was reading about Herb Alpert, the music legend, and how he's been sculpting and painting since the 70s, and he was exploring totem forms. And for those of you who don't know who Herb Alpert is, he's a Los Angeles native, a rock star from Boyle Heights. He's a rock star for his own solo work, as well as with his former band, the Tijuana Brass. He's also the founder of A&M Records, so was a prolific producer of many stars, such as the Carpenters, shown here. In the article I read, Herb Alpert's voice and story touched me. He said that his inspiration to take his own sculpture in a vertical direction happened in Stanley Park in Vancouver while he was on a break on his tour. He took a walk from the downtown in Vancouver to Stanley Park, which is the green area in the photo. I took this walk myself last June. It's about a 45-minute walk right from the center of Vancouver. Beautiful city. In the park, this was the scene he saw. He said, quote, "The Stanley Park sculptures triggered me. I started doing 12-foot totems that were symbolic, sort of like the indigenous people were doing. But then, looking for my own voice, they transitioned to spontaneous, jazz, riff-type sculptures." So I'm reading this article and I'm thinking to myself, I know the Hunts who make some of these poles. And I've now read that an American artist was deeply changed by them. So I feel this lovely transcultural exchange occurred. And I felt a rush that I wanted these artists working alone in their studios, far, far from each other, to meet, to connect through this cosmic artistic vibe. There was a spark that ricocheted from the Hunts to Herb, who lives in Los Angeles, across more than 1,500 miles, across borders, culture, space-time. I want you to meet Stan Hunt. Here's a 60-second commercial for a wind farm that Stan recently shot in Canada.
My name's Stan Hunt. My dad was a head carver after my grandfather at the Royal Provincial Museum. My dad showed me everything that I know today. It's hard to say how far it goes back. The history of our people goes back 8,500 years. When you're carving Kwakiutl, you can see that mask before it's finished, and then you bring that mask out. That's why artists see a bit of the future. Go to the big house to pass on names down to the next generation. It's got to be part of the Kwakiutl system forever. When you put a totem pole in front of your big house, it told everybody in the world who your family is. When we do totem poles for like the wind farm, the totem pole has the wildlife. What's up in the wind farm? This is all moving us forward in the future. It's perfect. We don't change our environment. We've always tried to live with the environment. We are part of the land. That's where we come from. That's where we go back to. We have to take care of the land. That's what keeps us on this planet. You know, we didn't invent this. We're just fortunate enough to be the people that carry on with this. I feel honored to be that.
Stan and his family live in the village of Fort Rupert on Vancouver Island, where apparently Meghan Markle lives now, I read today. They live on the northern tip of Vancouver Island. So after I read the Herb Alpert article, I called Stan at home. I shared with Stan the story of Herb Alpert and his moment in Stanley Park. And I asked Stan how he felt about that Herb had this inspirational moment. Stan thought it was pretty cool to know that another artist had been inspired by his family's traditional work. As you saw, Stan is a very gentle, kind person who is at one with nature. And from what I was reading about Herb, he was very similar. I mentioned to Stan a potential future exhibition where we might explore and celebrate how distant artists inspire each other, and he loved the idea. Here are 2 photos I took in their village while visiting them this past summer. You see here the outside of their meeting house called the Big House. And this is a wonderful drumming log in the elementary school where kids all sit at it and together learn the Kwakiutl drumming songs with little drumsticks. Here's a photo of Stan and Lavina and Micheline, who you just met from Sunnylands, inside their big house in Fort Rupert. It's truly awe-inspiring and breathtaking. And I took this photo out of my car window. This totem is their family tree, literally. This totem announces who this family is through the crests carved on the pole. We'll get into that a little bit later, how that works. So before I pursue this pretty random idea with Herb Alpert, I have to make sure the idea is fully sound. So I have to know more about Herb and Herb's work to make sure that the connection of verticality isn't the only link between these artists. There has to be a cohesive vibe here for this thing to work. So I researched his work, and I see and feel that Herb is drawing from nature. His work has a strong organic, biomorphic feeling, like something emerging from the earth. It seems to have a biology. So I dug in deeper. My fingers were crossed that his canon of work could commingle with the Hunt's in a real way, not forced. If Herb's art had looked like this, the idea would have been scrapped. Right? I could never defend this. I'd have a very different exhibition to show you today. This would be too difficult a stretch to imply that an artist such as this, nothing wrong with this art, but to argue that it has a meaningful intersection with the Hunt's would be ludicrous. I would be massacred by a lot of art critics. So luckily for me, Herb's work felt like it oozed from the ground. He said, quote, "I think that all art is a mystery. You can't put your finger on it. If you like a piece of work, if you like a sculpture, or you like a painting, or you like an actor, or a dance, or anything, you can't really put your finger on that element that touches you. When I played with Louis Armstrong, I would say to myself, what in the world is this guy doing that gets so right under your skin? And I realized that it was his persona. It came right through the instrument. We were hearing Louis. And so, I would argue, in Herb's work, we see Herb. I see birds in his work, and nature, and movement, and music. His work resonates well when placed in nature as well. It's not discordant. So now that you've met Stan, I want you to meet Herb. Here's a 180-second video of Herb and his wife, Lonnie Hall, to give you a sense now of who Herb is as a person and an artist, because you can't separate the two.
Exploring my creativity, it's not a hobby for me, man. It's a way of life. The mystery of art, you know? You can't tell me why you like a Louis Armstrong solo. You're supposed to feel it. That's what intrigues me about this whole thing. I mean, what makes something engaging to look at? A sculpture, a painting, even listening to music. What is that element that you say, wow, that's good?
Herb is very free, and he wants everybody to be free and to express themselves in the most honest way possible.
I started around 1970. In the 60s, traveling around the world with the Tijuana Brass. I was going to museums, and I got kind of turned on when I saw, a black painting with a purple dot, and then a white painting with a black dot, and I thought, let me try some of that. And so I started sculpting just for my own pleasure, and that's pretty much the way I've approached it. It's something that comes from hopefully a deep place. It's authentic in me. I don't try to impress anyone.
He's got over 1,000 paintings. He's got hundreds of sculptures. He's a prolific artist.
Sculptures are not only what you see, it has to be what you feel. It's not only the outside, the exterior of a piece, it's the interior. If the interior has energy, then I'm satisfied. It feels like I've created something that has a life of its own.
Being an artist, the biggest challenge that you have is to be as honest as you could be. That takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of insight, and that's how he is. That's who he is.
They're so beautiful, and they're so powerful, and they have a protective quality to them.
I had the pleasure of working with Sam Cooke. He used to tell me, Herbie, he says, people are just listening to a cold piece of wax, man, it either makes it or it don't. When you think about there's only 12 notes that we're all playing, man. I mean, Mozart had those same 12 notes, and so did Thelonious Monk, you know what I mean? These great musicians, they all had one thing in common. They were authentic. We're all looking for our own voice when we're an artist, and you try to find your own way of doing it.
So now that you've met Stan and Herb, you're probably beginning to see why I thought these artists should come together. All of these artists work in isolation of feedback. So for artists to show their work together, it's a really special occasion. So if this long shot idea really worked out, the show would be work from Henry, who carved the pole for the Annenbergs, his son Stan, his grandson Jason, and Herb Alpert. Okay, so now I'm feeling strong. I'm going to go for it. I'm going to approach Herb Alpert. Okay, so I didn't really stalk him. The truth is, you see Herb there in the background, and my neighbors and friends, Harry and Ruby Newman, are in the foreground. Harry has been Herb's architect and friend since the 70s, and he happens to be my neighbor in Palm Springs. So I asked Harry, you know, if you happen to talk to Herb, would you just float the idea of this exhibition by him? Sort of see how he feels about it. And so Harry did float it by him. And then Harry and Ruby brought me to one of Herb's gallery receptions. Here you see Herb in a gallery conversation with curator Chip Tom, who is here today, I think, and who was instrumental in supporting the idea of this exhibition and helped make this whole thing happen. So I discovered I love Herb's work. Herb says, quote, "I've gotten over trying to paint like my art heroes or to play like my favorite jazz musicians. As I get older, I'm just going to get up to my own water level, leave it at that, be as honest as I can be about my expressions, and have a good time." To my delight, these are the kinds of works I saw. I found warm, sinuous brushstrokes and sculptures with titles such as Dancing Mountain, Self-Preservation, Warrior, Magic Man. Herb said in an interview that if no one ever saw his work, he would still be compelled to sculpt and paint every day. Stan Hunt had said something very similar to me, as had Jason. Jason Hunt said, "Herb Alpert's sculptures are directly envisioned because of totem poles like Grandpa's, but he's interpreting it in a way that enhances his own artwork, whereas I come at it from a cultural standpoint. In fact," he said, "the exhibition is a cool way to show how art and different generations influence people." Herb's wife, Lonnie Hall, who you saw in the video, was there at the reception as well. And I know if there is to be a conversation, it will be with both of them. Lonnie, for those of you who don't know, is famous as well as the beautiful, haunting voice from the band Sergio Mendes and Brazil 66, among other things. They are a powerful musical couple. Married since the 70s, they're delightful to be around. So at the reception, I had this photo, just in case I got a chance to give my elevator pitch. Now, of course, no one is going to decide at a gallery opening that they want to do a future exhibition with a total stranger, but I thought this photo as an introduction was worth a million words as opposed to me blabbing on in a gallery. Because after all, I'm merely hoping to bridge Herb to these artists. I'm just putting these people together, so they don't need to hear me talk, they need to see this picture. So lucky me, Herb and Lonnie approached, wanted to hear a little more about the exhibition, and they liked what they heard, and we agreed to talk more in the future. As part of their process, to make sure they understood where I was coming from and who we are at Sunnylands, Herb and Lonnie and Chip visited Sunnylands and saw the Henry Hunt totem pole. Herb later said, "I was just overwhelmed by the property. That pole by Henry Hunt is one of the most beautiful wooden totems I have ever seen." And in the end, you know the rest. It was decided that we would make this happen. So now, after all the talk and research, I now had to make it happen. So now the work begins, assembling works of art from 3 living and 1 deceased artist that will intermingle well together and tell the stories I want to tell. One aspect of the story is simply to show that a California artist was inspired by faraway artists in Canada. The second part of the gallery story is that each artwork is exquisite on its own merit. Not knowing any of the history, each work should inspire. So, this is a beautiful mask by Jason. I borrowed it from the school on Vancouver Island. That little face in the middle pops out so that the children can wear that centerpiece when they're learning Kwakiutl dances. Later, when they're stronger, they can wear the entire mask. Photos from private collectors began to come in via email from Canada. I received photos of these 2 poles, which are obviously living in collectors' homes. And I chose to borrow the white one to tell a third story in the gallery, which is that although Jason and Stan inherited traditional motifs from Henry, and they respect those graphics, these contemporary living artists are not frozen people in a history book. They're alive and evolving. So they also riff on their own motifs. And so this white pole shows that young Jason is venturing outside tradition with his graphics and his colors. This multiple raven mask is also by Jason. So you can see he can execute both in traditional and contemporary styles. About this work, Jason said, "The most important of all of our supernatural creatures in our lexicon is the raven. He bridges the real world and the spirit world together. And in our stories, he's the creator and a trickster." This photo came in from one of Stan's collectors. It's called Welcome Moon, and this shows that Stan's work is also not stagnant and trapped in time. So this mask certainly references Kwakiutl figures, but as you can see, it's far more contemporary in its design, and it's made of plaster rather than wood. So Stan is exploring like all artists do. I considered works that were available directly from Herb, his gallerists, and others as well. I was very fortunate to have many things to choose from to tell the stories. John and Robin of local design group JCRR, who are our art directors and do all our design work, are shown here. Herb was very generous and hands-on through the entire process. He just kept showing me more and more things. I chose the middle totem here for the exhibition to show that in the beginning, Herb started out stacking distinct figures, such as North Coast totems do. This represents the beginning of his totem process. And as Herb let his own vibe take over, he ended up fully abstracting that initial vertical inspiration into what he calls his jazz poles. So his own personal journey from stacked figures to a complete abstraction is represented in the exhibition as well, his journey. Here's some earlier works. So in making individual art choices, you also want to be mindful of how all the works will commingle. And with multiple artists, you're also aware of parity and creating a lovely interplay while balancing all of the very different kinds of contributions. So each choice is critical. And I actually just kept taking photos of my workboard because I was really terrified I was going to lose it because it was complicated work, and I just kept working out that inclusion-exclusion matrix to make sure there was balance between everything. And so the final selections were made, and now the loan requests are sent out. So I want to take a moment to discuss some of the other challenges I was always mindful of when making selections. My own culture is Western European, so before making any choices, I need to always be aware that I'm working with a culture outside my own. And so I know not to depend on any of my own Western European mind, thoughts and filters and experiences to interpret what I'm seeing. So we can all see that this is a sun, and we know that it maybe is a mask of some kind, but we can never really know what deep personal meaning this has to the people who carved this. So I always tried to stay aware of that. And so, too, I want to make sure that I'm not unintentionally mishandling or trivializing cultural property that I can never really understand. I worked closely with the Hunts to understand as much as I could. In fact, Mickalene and I did a 2.5-hour taped oral history with Stan and Jason at the Yard House at the river. Many beers were drunk, but much was learned. Much. Lots of data. I'm also aware that in our culture right now, there's this accusation popping around called cultural appropriation. In other words, using something from someone else's culture. Well, in the arts, art has always been iterative, to my mind. The evidence of art ideas migrating from Asia to Greece and all around the world is everywhere in art. So while I was curating this show, the annual Met Ball in New York occurred, and photos like these were all over the media. This event celebrated a show at the Met exploring the beautiful textiles and iconography of the Catholic Church. I thought, how can these celebrities get away with dressing like this? I mean, if this isn't cultural appropriation, what is? So I looked into it, and I found out that the Metropolitan Museum had asked the Vatican for permission to explore their religious textiles and artistry. So in other words, they asked for permission. If the artists are cool with the riffing on their art, and in fact, perhaps even excited by it, maybe it's not cultural appropriation. So that's what I had done. I had asked the Hunts. So I felt pretty good about this concern. In fact, the Hunts themselves are not the only family and culture to carve house poles. Poles similar to theirs appear across the currents. This is a house in New Zealand, photographed around 1900. So clearly, an iteration of house poles had traveled long before they traveled to Los Angeles, to the studio of Herb Alpert. So I also had to learn a new vocabulary, so there was definitely a learning curve on this one to understand, at least in a shallow way, some of the words that are important to the Kwakiutl people. And so the works begin to arrive from the various artists' studios across Canada and California. The Hunts brought their own art down, and so they had a lovely moment to visit their dad's pole out on the golf course. And while we're doing the exhibition, a catalog enters production at the same time. So enter the fabulous local photographer, Mark Davidson, who's responsible for all of the really gorgeous art photography in the catalog. We shot in several locations. And I would be dead in the water if I didn't have the support of the Sunnylands staff when I say random things to them like, hey, could you guys help me lift this massive, fragile, culturally important totem pole out of that crate? And could you just stand it up in the maintenance yard so I could take a picture of it? The Sunnylands staff depend on one another, and this is just one of the many ways the staff supports making these exhibitions happen. Couldn't do it without them. More photography. We went wherever the art was, and at whatever time the art looked at its best. There's Mark taking one for the team there. So here's Mark Davidson again on the left, and our art director and designer who designs all of our catalogs on the right, Robin Rout. And they convinced me that it was imperative for this shot to occur at 5:30 a.m. on the golf course. Well, I'm someone who doesn't believe there is gravity at 5:30 a.m., but Robin's a genius, and so we made it out to the damp 5th fairway in the dark, and as the sun began to rise, We did get hit with sprinklers. Sort of forgot to tell the guys to turn the sprinklers off, but we got our catalog cover shot. Yeah, so I think it was worth it. As a curator, you want to also be open to happy accidents. Rigidity creates less inspiring work, as we all know. New ideas can come from anywhere and anyone. And in this case, we were photographing a group of small models I had selected from Herb's studio to show his small handworks over time and his arc toward abstraction. And as we began to fuss and assemble them together on this piece of wood we found laying around in the studio, we all found that the tableau this little group photo created was really pleasant. This little grouping just sort of vibrated, it sprung. And so we fussed with it some more, and we traced their positions on the board so that we could recreate this exactly in the gallery. And so here's how it looks in the gallery. And Herb says about his small model process, quote, "It's hard to say how I choose which of the small models to cast as a larger bronze. Some of those little pieces just look monumental." And so while the art is arriving and the catalog's being written, we're also designing the gallery. What colors will work? How do we arrange the art to best interact with each other while also displaying well individually? Karina White is my go-to designer out of Los Angeles. Somehow she makes sense out of all of our babbling in the archives department. So after much fussing and refussing over every detail, the exhibition's finally installed. And for those of you who like the backstory, I would say this one took about 5 days. And by the way, none of this happens without our facilities crew, and none of this happens without our archives crew. We have Zulma Trejo, Frank Lopez, and Mary Velez, and I see 2 of them are here, and nothing happens without the team we have. So here's an example of creating an interaction between Stan's totem pole and Herb's poles. Stan's wood pole couldn't be outside in the sun, while Herb's bronze poles could. So we created the interaction through the glass, placing them all in the same sight line as you enter the building. So you can see the traditional pole in the foreground and the poles that were inspired by it in an arc around it. And if you wonder how many hands it takes to lift that wood pole without falling back through that glass, this is just one of the many reasons I have a lot of gray hair right here. And here's another view. Placing the outdoor totems with those vertical window frames was a challenge, but we looked at it from lots of angles and hopefully framed it pretty well. And if you wonder, how involved would an artist like Herb Alpert be in his art and his installations? Well, there he is with his back to the camera. He attended this day-long installation for the outdoor poles. It was 115 degrees that August day, but he was there supporting the process. And for those of you who wonder how the magic happens with a 2-ton bronze, here are some install shots. Thoughtful artists who construct monumental works of art, they think about how they're going to be safely mounted. So Herb builds mount infrastructure into his casts, which is really wonderful. And here's a shot of Herb and Lonnie, and in the middle is their studio manager, Kristen Marvell. He's been with Herb about 30 years, I think. So we intentionally sought juxtapositions like this. This is Jason's multiple raven mask, juxtaposed with Herb's painting called Bolero. You can see here how much I was thrilled with how the artist's work really interacted with each other. And here's another example of how Herb and Stan and Jason, living so far apart from each other, how their work comes together and doesn't clash. Herb's painting on the left is called Midnight Moon, next to Stan's Welcome Moon and Jason's The Protectors. And this interaction, we show Herb's totem models on the right and Henry Hunt's totem models on the left. These models represent that both of these artists work out their pole designs in smaller form before these works go as tall as 40 feet. So in the final section of the presentation, I'll just share with you some of the examples of the words the artists used to describe their own work in the exhibition. But first we'll begin with Stan describing his father Henry's pole at Sunnylands. At the top of this pole sits the chief. He wears this beautiful yellow chilkat blanket and is holding a copper, that funny little shaped guy right there. That's a sign of wealth or power. The 3 rings on the hat, Stan told us, represent the fact that his dad, who carved this pole, was chief 3 times. So in fact, this is a self-portrait of Henry Hunt. Now, here's something for you all to take away today and know forever. When you see totem poles and other North Coast carvings, Stan said, quote, "Family crest figures are the only figures you're allowed to carve. I can't carve a butterfly, for instance. And actually, this is one of the only crests our family doesn't own. When my dad carved the Annenberg's pole, he utilized family crests. We are all limited to carving the family crests, and we all know this. Every artist on the West Coast is limited to what their family owns. Some will bend the rules and use whatever they want, but the rest of us know that it's wrong. The people who have my pieces, they know the difference." So below the chief is this bear holding a little gray seal, both, of course, family crests. Stan recounted for us how his family came to be so powerful and own so many crests. Quote, "My mom and dad had an arranged marriage. My mom's dad was Alex Nelson, who was one of the highest-ranking Kwakiutl chiefs. Then our dad's dad was a huge chief in Fort Rupert. So when our parents were really young, they were promised to each other, and they were married in the big house. The arranged marriages were to bring the dowries together. This marriage made our family bigger and more powerful, kind of like a royal wedding." The 3rd figure from the top of the pole represents Sonnequa, the wild woman of the woods. There's always a wild woman in every lexicon. Notice she too is holding a copper shape. Stan thought for sure that his dad Henry was making a witty insider statement on the pole about the Annenberg's wealth to show 2 coppers on one pole. Sonnequa is a cannibal giant, and she carries a basket on her back in which she places children she captures. She takes these children home to eat, but in most versions of the myth, the children manage to escape. Stan Hunt provided an update to this. He said, "You know, Anne, if you read 10 different books by 10 different anthropologists, you'll read 10 different versions. Her pursed lips might be making a wind sound to lull the kids into thinking they're safe, but my take on the Sonnequa is that she's basically like every culture's boogeyman. I mean, it's a big open forest out there. It really keeps the kids in the village to tell them a story like that." Oops. And finally, the bottom figure on the pole is Susterl, a double-headed serpent. This creature can change at will from mythical to human form. Stan said, "Susterl is a main crest of both my grandmothers, so this was probably my dad paying honor to his mother." Bolero on the left by Herb Alpert, and a sun mask on the right by Stan Hunt. Herb said, "When I paint or sculpt, I don't have anything in mind. I don't have a goal in mind other than form. I'm looking for that form that touches me, and when I find it, I stop." And Stan said about having his own work at Sunnylands, where a pole by his father stands, quote, "It's come around full circle." Herb said, "If a work doesn't buzz you, it's not for you. No one can make you react to a painting or a sculpture." And here you see grandson Jason exploring his contemporary style. Notice the raven here has a whale's tail. This panel is a personal expression of an extraordinary day Jason told us about near his home. Last year, he took a little motorboat out to an island off the coast. He told me not to tell you which island, where he had heard graves and offerings to the graves of his ancestors existed. While exploring the beach on the island, a little raven kept hopping the trees, following him. And eventually, the raven led him into the woods to a hidden ancestral memorial. Later, returning to the beach, Jason saw a whale breach out of the waves right in front of him. He gathered the shells on the island to represent the bones of his ancestors, because they are buried there on that island. So as you can see, this piece tells that story of the raven, the whale, and the gravesite. It's called The Protectors. Herb sometimes paints with concentrated organic coffee as a medium. He likes it, he says, because of its intensity. Masks are essential components to ceremonial Kwakiutl life. They're worn and danced with during special events in that big house you saw called potlatches. One dance is called the Hamatsa ritual, where 3 masked dancers, and they do dance with this 11-foot mask, 3 masked dancers depict bird monsters. Legend holds that these naughty bird monsters inhabit the sky world and, working together, eat humans. This is Hook Hook, and is the first to attack the human. This 11-foot monster hits the human on the head with its long beak. The second to dance is Crooked Beak. He eats the brains of the human. And the raven, the creator, devours what's left of the person. And here's how we installed the 3 naughty sky monster birds together. And these are all operational masks, by the way, and they've all been danced in the big house. Kids love these guys. Herb says, when you see something that touches you, you can't describe it. It's the feeling you want. I think he said that in the film too. And I'm going to repeat that. It's the feeling you want. So this artist isn't going for imitating real objects here. He's expressing feeling. Abstract art is intentionally a different kind of thing. It's a device to spark emotion, to fire your brain in a different way. The artist knows he's not duplicating real things, and that's on purpose, to hopefully provoke your neurons. And I would guess that abstract artists also know that some people become very frustrated by abstract art, which is in itself, of course, a strong response. And here's some evidence of Herb as an artist who daily works through his hands to create and to try to let that creativity flow honestly. Bookwus, wild man of the woods. This forest-dwelling Bookwus is a significant supernatural character in Kwakiutl mythology. He's typically depicted very much like this, skeletal with sunken eyes and cheeks and a bird's beak. And this one has horsehair, as you'll see in the gallery. And in fact, we got pictures from the museum from which we borrowed this, and the pictures were like this. So I think in our description in the catalog, we wrote white horsehair, but in fact, it's a big mane of white and black horsehair, but we couldn't see the black hair in the photo. Legend holds it that this guy eats ghost food, and he tries to tempt humans to eat it so that they will be forced to remain in his haunted world. This distinct shape you might recognize from the Sunnylands pole as a copper. It represents wealth or power and can be adorned with a variety of figures. Stan Hunt chose the legendary frog woman for this beautiful glass sculpture because it was a crest belonging to his mother. Pugwis, man from the sea. This aquatic creature started out a human fisherman who was fishing on his boat, but he was not having any luck. The chief of the sea, Komakwa, sent a ratfish up to the surface to see what Pugwis was doing. The ratfish started circling the boat to see what Pugwis was up to, and Pugwis tried to hit the ratfish with his oar. So the ratfish went back down and tattled to Komakwa, who then sent a killer whale up to bring Pugwis under the ocean for an education. Pugwis lived under the sea for 7 days and nights, learning about the creatures of the ocean. And when he returned to the earth, he had transformed into this aquatic person. In his mouth, Pugwis gently cradles a seal because he now understands everything about the sea. I had originally written in the catalog that Pugwis was eating the seal, but Stan called me immediately and said, Anne, Pugwis is cradling the seal, very gently cradling the seal, not eating the seal. Big difference. And finally, I can't leave here without sharing this charming artwork by Jason Hunt. He borrowed this from his Aunt Dorothy. He said, quote, "Animals, obviously, you've learned today, have supernatural symbolism in the Kwakiutl culture. Mice are believed to be messengers who run all around the village, and they gather every morsel of data and information. And then the owls swoop down and eat the mice, and therefore owls ingest all the knowledge, which makes them the wisest." So I hope some of these artworks and stories have sparked your interest in Kwakiutl art or cultural exchange or abstract art, and the generosity of the artists in this exhibition who took that leap to show their work together, to make art, and they shared with us their personal stories. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Oh, okay. Thank you so much.